Oh my God.
After 22 years of marriage, Robert Hayes came home to a deadbolt he didn't recognize. He stood on the porch of the house he had lived in for 2 decades, keys in his hand, keys that no longer fit the lock his wife had changed that afternoon. He knocked once, then again, harder, and through the door he heard her voice, calm in a way that frightened him more than shouting ever could. "You made it clear I wasn't your wife anymore," she said. "So I stopped being one." 3 weeks earlier, those exact words had come out of his own mouth, thrown at her in the middle of an argument he thought she would forget by morning. She never forgot. And what she did with those words would end up changing both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted that night. Her name was Linda Hayes, and for 22 years she had built her entire identity around being Robert's wife. She raised their 2 children in that house. She learned to cook his mother's recipes exactly the way he liked them. She rearranged her own career, her own friendships, her own sense of self around the shape of his life. To everyone who knew them, the Hayes marriage looked steady, even enviable. Neighbors described them as the couple who still held hands at church on Sundays. But steady is not the same as honest. And what Linda didn't know yet was that the version of her marriage she believed in had already started to crumble in places she couldn't see. The cracks had been forming quietly, in small absences and unanswered questions, long before that one sentence broke everything open. Before we go any further into how this marriage reached its breaking point, we want to hear from you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened between Robert and Linda Hayes was not a single moment of anger. It was the final line in a story that had been writing itself for years, one late night and one small lie at a time. To understand why she locked that door and why he said those words in the first place, we have to go back to the beginning, back to who Robert and Linda were before either of them became the people standing on opposite sides of a locked door. Because the truth is, the woman who calmly told her husband he was no longer welcome in his own home was not the same woman who married him 22 years earlier. Something had changed in her long before that night, and by the time Robert realized it, it was already too late for him to change it back. Linda and Robert Hayes met in their late 20s at a friend's wedding in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. Robert was the kind of man who remembered small details, the color of her dress, the song playing when they first spoke, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes even when they weren't funny. Linda had been cautious with love before him, guarded after a string of relationships that left her feeling more like an afterthought than a priority. But Robert was different, or at least that is what she believed in those early years. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. Within 18 months he had proposed, and within 2 years, they were married in a small ceremony surrounded by family who genuinely believed they were watching 2 people build something built to last. The first 10 years of their marriage were, by most accounts, good years. Robert worked steadily as a regional sales manager, and Linda taught elementary school, a job she loved even on the hardest days. They had 2 children, a son named Ethan and a daughter named Claire, and their house filled with the ordinary noise of a family finding its rhythm. Linda often told friends that Robert was a good father, present at school plays, patient during homework struggles, the kind of man who coached Little League even after long work weeks. From the outside, nothing about their life suggested trouble. But underneath the routine of school mornings and Sunday dinners, small habits had already begun to form, habits that would matter far more than either of them realized at the time. It started subtly. Robert began working later, first once a week, then twice, then most nights by the time their children were in middle school. Linda noticed. But she told herself it was simply the cost of providing for a family, that ambition and exhaustion often wore the same face. She stopped asking questions about his schedule because the answers were always reasonable, always logical, always just believable enough. Meanwhile, Linda quietly absorbed more of the household, more of the parenting, more of the emotional weight of keeping their family steady. She told herself this was simply what marriage required, that partnership sometimes meant carrying more than your share without complaint. She did not yet understand that the imbalance she was accepting would, years later, become the very thing that broke her. By their 15th year of marriage, Linda had become someone she barely recognized when she looked in the mirror. She had given up a promotion at her school because Robert's schedule made it impossible to manage drop-offs and pickups alone. She had let go of friendships that once meant everything to her, friendships Robert quietly discouraged without ever explicitly forbidding them. She told herself these were small sacrifices, the kind every marriage requires. But somewhere in the space between raising two children and managing a home that increasingly felt like hers alone to hold together, Linda Hayes had quietly disappeared into the role of Robert's wife, and she would not fully understand what she had lost until the night everything came apart. By the time their children were teenagers, Linda had learned to live with a version of Robert that showed up less and less at home. His work trips grew longer. His phone stayed face down on the counter, and when it lit up at odd hours, he would glance at it quickly and slide it into his pocket without explanation. Linda told herself she trusted him, because that is what 20 years of marriage was supposed to earn a person: the benefit of the doubt, the assumption of good faith. But trust built on assumption instead of honesty is a fragile thing, and small moments began to chip away at it. A hotel receipt from a city he said he never visited. A birthday he forgot that he had never forgotten before. A distance in his voice on the phone that had nothing to do with a bad connection. Linda did not confront him at first. She told herself she was choosing peace over conflict, protecting their children from tension, protecting the life they had built from a fight that might not be worth having. But peace built on silence has a cost, and Linda was paying it every day in a slow erosion of her own confidence. She began to second-guess her instincts, to wonder if she was imagining problems that did not exist, to apologize for feelings she had every right to hold. Robert, for his part, seemed to sense her hesitation and used it, not cruelly at first, but carelessly, the way people do when they believe someone will always stay no matter how far they push. The night everything changed began like most of their arguments did, over something small. Linda had asked a simple question about a weekend trip Robert claimed was for work, a trip with a hotel confirmation email she had accidentally seen open on his laptop. He grew defensive immediately, accusing her of snooping, of not trusting him, of turning a normal business trip into an interrogation. Linda pressed gently, not accusing him of anything, simply asking him to be honest with her the way she had always tried to be honest with him. That is when Robert said the words that would end up defining the rest of their story. He looked at her, tired and irritated, and told her that she had not acted like his wife in years, that she nagged instead of supported him, that she had turned into someone he no longer recognized as his partner. And then he said it plainly. "You're not my wife anymore. Not really." He walked out that night to cool off, the way he always did after their arguments, fully expecting to come home the next day to the same patient woman who had absorbed every disappointment before it. But something in Linda broke differently that night, quietly and completely. She sat alone in the kitchen long after he left, replaying not just that argument, but years of them. Years of small dismissals stacked one on top of another until they formed a shape she could finally see clearly. She thought about Ethan and Claire, about the example she was setting for them, about what it meant to raise children while quietly disappearing inside her own marriage. By the time morning came, Linda had made a decision, one she had never seriously considered in 22 years together. She called a locksmith before she called anyone else, and by early afternoon, the locks on the home she had built with Robert Hayes no longer recognized his key. Robert Hayes returned home the following evening, still carrying the same expectation he always carried after one of their arguments, that Linda would be waiting with dinner half made and a tired but forgiving smile. Instead, he found a house that no longer opened for him. His key slid into the lock and stopped, refusing to turn, and for a moment he stood on the porch convinced he had somehow grabbed the wrong set of keys. He knocked, first casually, then with growing confusion, calling Linda's name through the door. When she finally answered, she did not open it. She spoke to him through the wood, her voice steady in a way he had never heard from her before, and repeated the words he had thrown at her 3 weeks earlier, handing them back to him with none of the anger he expected and all of the calm he could not argue with. News of the locked door did not stay contained to their household for long. Ethan, now 19 and away at college, heard about it from his mother directly, in a phone call where Linda finally told her son the truth about years he had only half understood as a child. Claire, 17 and still living at home, watched the entire confrontation unfold from an upstairs window, torn between loyalty to a father she loved and a growing understanding of what her mother had quietly endured for years. Extended family took sides quickly. Robert's mother called Linda, accusing her of humiliating her son in front of the neighborhood. Linda's sister, who had watched this marriage from a careful distance for 2 decades, told Linda privately that she should have done this years earlier. For the first few days, Robert stayed with his brother across town, telling anyone who would listen that Linda had overreacted, that every marriage has hard seasons, that changing locks over one bad argument was extreme and unnecessary. He called her repeatedly, alternating between apologies and frustration, at times softening enough to make Linda question her decision, at other times growing defensive enough to confirm exactly why she had made it. There was one evening, nearly a week in, when Robert showed up at the door with flowers and an apology that sounded almost convincing, and for a moment, standing there listening to him, Linda felt the old pull to simply let him back inside and return to the marriage she knew. But something stopped her that night, a quiet clarity she had never allowed herself to feel before. The understanding that an apology without real change was simply another version of the same pattern that had cost her 22 years of herself. What Robert did not know, and what Linda had not yet said out loud to anyone, was that the locked door was never really about that one argument. It was about a slow accumulation of years spent shrinking herself to fit inside a marriage that had stopped making room for her. And as the days turned into weeks, with Robert still locked out and their children watching closely to see what their mother would do next, Linda began to uncover something else entirely, a piece of the truth about her marriage that would change not just how this story ended, but how she understood every year that came before it. It happened almost by accident. Nearly 3 weeks after Linda changed the locks, she was going through old files in a shared cloud account, searching for tax documents she needed for an appointment, when she came across a folder she did not recognize. Inside were receipts, confirmations, and messages tied to a second phone line Robert had been paying for quietly through a business account for almost 4 years. At first, Linda assumed it was simply a work expense she had overlooked. But as she read further, she realized the account was not connected to his job at all. It belonged to a woman named Sarah Whitfield, someone Linda had never met, someone Robert had apparently known since long before that hotel receipt she had first questioned. The messages told a story far more complicated than Linda had prepared herself for. This was not a brief lapse in judgment or a single mistake made in a weak moment. The relationship with Sarah had existed quietly for years, running parallel to the family life Linda had spent decades protecting. Business trips she believed were routine had, in some cases, included visits neither work-related nor accidental. Late nights she attributed to exhaustion had, in truth, sometimes been something else entirely. Linda sat with this information for hours before she said a single word to anyone, trying to reconcile the man she had built a life with alongside the version of him hidden in those messages. What struck Linda most, once the initial shock settled, was not just the betrayal itself, but how much sense it suddenly made of everything that came before it. The distance, the irritability, the words he had thrown at her that final night, the accusation that she was not acting like his wife anymore. Linda finally understood that Robert had not simply grown tired of their marriage. He had spent years quietly building a second life, and his frustration with her had never really been about her at all. It had been guilt, projected outward, easier to place on her shoulders than to admit to himself. Linda realized that in locking the door, she had unknowingly protected herself before she even understood exactly what she was protecting herself from. When Robert finally learned that Linda had found the messages, his explanations shifted quickly, from denial to minimization to a final admission that the relationship with Sarah Whitfield had, in fact, lasted years, not months as he first claimed. He asked for a chance to fix things, insisting the marriage was still worth saving, that people make mistakes, that 22 years together should count for something. Linda listened to all of it without raising her voice, without the anger she once assumed she would feel in this exact moment. Instead, she felt something closer to certainty, the kind of clarity that only comes once every question has finally been answered. Linda did not make her final decision that same day, though the outcome had already become clear in her mind. She spent the following week speaking honestly with Ethan and Claire, no longer shielding them from the full truth of what their father had done. She met with a lawyer for the first time in her life, not out of anger, but out of a quiet determination to protect the years ahead of her, the way she had once tried to protect the marriage behind her. Robert continued to reach out, alternating between pleading and frustration, but Linda's answers grew shorter and steadier each time, until there was very little left to say. The locked door that once represented a single night of hurt had become something else entirely, a boundary Linda intended to keep for good. Robert eventually moved into an apartment across town, the same apartment he had once used, Linda later learned, during visits with Sarah Whitfield years earlier. Their divorce was finalized within the year, quieter than either of them expected, without the dramatic confrontations that had marked their final months together. Linda kept the house, the home she had built and maintained largely on her own for years without fully realizing it. Ethan and Claire, though heartbroken over their parents' marriage ending, told Linda more than once that they respected her more in that year than they had in their entire childhood, watching her rebuild her life with a steadiness that surprised even her. Linda Hayes did not set out to become a story people would talk about. She simply reached a point where 22 years of quiet sacrifice met one sentence she could no longer absorb in silence. Looking back, she often says the locked door was never really about keeping Robert out. It was about finally letting herself back in, into a life, an identity, and a sense of worth she had slowly given away one compromise at a time. Whether you believe she was right to lock that door, or believe there was still a version of that marriage worth saving, one thing remains true. Linda Hayes walked away from that house exactly the way she walked into it 22 years earlier, on her own terms. Before you go, tell us in the comments, do you think Linda made the right decision that night, and would you have done the same thing in her place? Before we dive deeper into stories like this one, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.